She was folding a monogrammed towel into a cedar chest she'd been filling since she was 14, not knowing in 6 months she'd be using every piece inside it. Nobody wrote these rules down. Everybody still had to follow them. This was a decade when almost every American woman married young, and marriage came with an entire hidden curriculum nobody handed you as a single document. It lived in etiquette books, in whispered advice from mothers, in the pages of bridal magazines. Break one of these unspoken rules and the whole town seemed to know by Sunday. Today we're walking through the code, rule by rule, and what it actually meant to live inside it. Rule 1, and it started years before any wedding was even in sight. A girl began her hope chest as young as 13 or 14, tucking away towels, quilts, and embroidered pillowcases long before she had a name to attach to any of it. It wasn't sentimental decoration. It was a hedge against having nothing when the day finally came, built one linen at a time, quietly, patiently, for years. Furniture companies understood this ritual better than anyone, and one company in particular built an entire promotion around it. Lane Furniture spent decades gifting engraved cedar hope chests to graduating high school girls through local stores, turning graduation day into a marriage track milestone housed in the very same wooden box. Many of those chests still sit in attics today, a girl's name still carved into the lid. What went inside that chest followed its own quiet checklist: sheets, towels, tablecloths, all monogrammed with the initials she hoped to carry someday, stitched by hand in the evenings after school and chores were done. A girl might spend years on a single set of embroidered pillowcases, adding to the chest slowly, so that by the time a suitor finally appeared, half the work of building a household was already finished. A hope chest wasn't filled all at once with a single big purchase either. It grew piece by piece, often as birthday and Christmas gifts from aunts and grandmothers, each relative contributing one more towel or one more tablecloth to a project the whole extended family understood was underway. By the time a wedding date was finally set, the chest itself had become a kind of family scrapbook made of linen instead of photographs. Rule 2. A suitor did not simply show up at a girl's door. He asked the father first, a formal conversation in the parlor or on the porch, hat in hand, before he was ever permitted to properly call on a daughter. It sounds old-fashioned now, almost theatrical. At the time, it meant something real. It told a family their daughter's time was being taken seriously, not casually spent by a boy passing through. This wasn't a formality either side could skip. Fathers were known to ask a young man directly about his job, his prospects, his intentions, sometimes over a full evening on the porch while the daughter waited inside, listening through an open window. A suitor who couldn't answer plainly, who hedged or dodged, often didn't get invited back a second time. The father's approval was the first real gate, and it wasn't ceremonial. It carried actual weight. Once permission was granted, the young man would call at the house itself, sitting in the family parlor while the parents remained close by, sometimes in the very next room. Formal calling had already faded from its Victorian peak by this decade, but in small towns and traditional families, it stayed the expected first stage of any serious courtship. It gave courtship a witness, and a witness gave it real weight. A first call at the house also came with a strict clock attached to it. Courting couples were expected to keep visits to a reasonable hour, and a young man who overstayed his welcome, lingering past 10 on a weeknight, risked the father appearing in the parlor doorway without a word needing to be said. The porch light itself became a signal in many households, switched off as a quiet, wordless cue that the evening had ended. Rule 3. A woman did not telephone a man to ask him out, full stop. Etiquette columns of the era treated this as more than simple impoliteness. It was framed as something that could genuinely damage a woman's reputation, as though dialing first on a rotary phone cast doubt on her character before a word was even spoken. The rule sounds almost impossible to modern ears. At the time, it was simply understood, and everyone understood exactly why. So women became fluent in indirect signals instead. A girl might mention loudly enough for a boy to hear that she'd be at the church social on Friday, or that she had no escort yet for the spring dance. It was a workaround built entirely around a rule she couldn't break directly. The initiative still had to look like it came from him, even when everyone in the room understood exactly whose idea it really was. Some families still relied on an actual chaperone for outings beyond the parlor, an older sister, an aunt, sometimes a neighbor, tagging along to a dance or a picture show to keep a courting couple within proper view. By this decade, the practice was already fading fast from its Victorian peak, but it hadn't vanished entirely, especially for younger teenagers or in more traditional and religious households across the South and Midwest. Rule 4. Going steady meant something you could actually see. A boy gave a girl his class ring, his ID bracelet, sometimes his Letterman jacket, and she wore it openly at school, in the hallway, at the soda fountain. It wasn't a private understanding between two people. It was a public announcement worn on the body, and everyone at that school read the signal the same way, instantly, without a single word. This system had its own hierarchy, too. Wearing a ring on a chain around your neck meant something slightly different from wearing it on your finger with tape wound around the band to make it fit. Every classmate could read the difference at a glance, could tell you exactly how serious a couple was, simply by studying what jewelry sat where. It was a whole silent language, and every teenager in that hallway spoke it fluently. On college campuses, the ritual escalated into something almost theatrical. A young man would give his fraternity pin to the girl he was serious about, and that same night, his fraternity brothers would gather outside her dormitory window to serenade the newly pinned couple. Neighbors leaned out of other windows just to watch. It was public commitment staged as public performance, and nobody in that courtyard doubted what it meant. The serenade itself followed a script almost as fixed as the courtship it announced. The fraternity had a specific pinning song, sung low and close together beneath the window, and every sorority sister in the building knew exactly what those opening notes meant before a single word was sung. Some girls remembered that serenade for the rest of their lives, more vividly even than the wedding that followed years later. Breaking up while going steady carried its own quiet protocol, too. The ring or the jacket had to be returned, usually handed back in person or through a mutual friend, and that returned object traveled through a school faster than any spoken rumor could. A girl seen without a boy's ring she had worn all semester needed no explanation. The hallway had already read the news before she said a single word about it. Rule 5. Once a couple was engaged, it was still the bride's father, traditionally, who announced it formally in the local newspaper. Her photograph ran beside a short paragraph naming her father's occupation, her education, and her fiancé's employer. It reads today like a strange amount of detail to publish about a private decision. At the time, a courtship's outcome was treated as genuine civic information. That announcement did real social work beyond simply spreading news. It confirmed, in ink, that a courtship had cleared every earlier gate, the father's approval, the going steady stage, the public commitment. Neighbors who'd been quietly watching a couple for months finally had it on paper. In a town small enough that everyone read the same paper over the same Sunday breakfast, that single paragraph could travel faster than any phone call. A family with more than one daughter faced its own quiet arithmetic around these newspaper announcements. Younger sisters were sometimes gently discouraged from getting too serious with a suitor before an older sister's own engagement was announced first. It wasn't a hard rule anyone enforced with real consequence, but the etiquette of birth order shaped a surprising number of courtships behind the scenes, especially in larger families. Rule 6 concerned the ring itself, and this one has a history most people never learn. The expectation that a man spend roughly 1 month's salary on a diamond wasn't ancient wisdom passed down through generations. It was a marketing line, built by an advertising agency working for a diamond company, that launched its famous campaign in the late 1940s. It felt timeless. It was closer to an invention. It worked because it gave an uncertain moment a fixed rule to hold on to. A young man walking into a jewelry store had no formula for how much love was supposed to cost. The salary guideline handed him one, tidy and specific, and it spread through advice columns and jewelry counters until it felt like something grandmothers had always said, rather than a slogan barely a few years old. An engagement ring in this decade typically ran somewhere between $200 and $400. Real money for a young man just starting out in a factory job or a first office position. Some saved for the better part of a year specifically to hit that number, treating the ring less as jewelry and more as visible proof he was ready to provide. A promise you could hold up to the light and see. Rule 7. A bride was expected to build her trousseau, a complete wardrobe and set of household linens assembled before the wedding, not after. Etiquette writers of the day devoted entire chapters to exactly how many monogrammed towels, sheets, and tablecloths a proper trousseau required. This wasn't shopping. It was preparation for running an entire household from the very first morning. Emily Post and Amy Vanderbilt, the two most trusted etiquette authorities in American homes, both devoted real space in their books to exactly this task. Vanderbilt's own guide, published in 1952, walked a reader through trousseau assembly with the seriousness of a household ledger. A bride who followed it closely could tell you, almost item by item, whether she was ready. The trousseau nightgown occupied a category all its own, discreet and specific, tucked quietly into the bridal sections of mail-order catalogs rather than displayed openly on any store shelf. There was a real vocabulary built around approaching that first private night with modesty and ceremony, treating it as something to prepare for thoughtfully, the same unhurried way she'd prepared her linens and her silver. Rule 8. A bride registered for one good pattern of sterling silver, and she was expected to treat it as something almost sacred, reserved only for occasions formal enough to deserve it. Companies like Gorham and Towel made the patterns that filled countless closets across the country. Many of those silver sets sat wrapped in felt for years, sometimes decades, waiting for an occasion grand enough to earn a place on the table. This wasn't wasteful hoarding. It reflected a genuine belief that some occasions deserved more than everyday dishes could offer, and that a household should always be ready for one, even if it rarely arrived. A woman might go her entire first decade of marriage using the good silver only a handful of times, at holidays, at anniversaries, at the visit from a relative who mattered. The waiting itself was part of the ritual. Rule 9. Choosing that silver pattern, and the china to match it, happened at a department store counter that hadn't existed a generation earlier. Marshall Fields in Chicago had pioneered the bridal registry back in 1924, letting a bride select patterns that out-of-town relatives could simply reference and buy. By this decade, the idea had spread across the country, quietly inventing the registry system still used today. If a family lived too far from a department store to browse counters in person, the Sears catalog brought the same rituals to their kitchen table instead. It carried its own dedicated bridal and trousseau sections, letting a rural bride order monogrammed linens and registry-style patterns entirely by mail. Distance from the city didn't excuse a woman from the rules. Commerce simply found its way to her anyway. Rule 10. The wedding gown almost always had to be white, and the reason traces back further than most people expect. Queen Victoria wore white for her own wedding back in 1840, and it took over a century for that single choice to become an unspoken requirement for nearly every American bride. Hollywood films and department store bridal salons finished the job this decade, until any other color felt like a quiet rebellion. But the gowns themselves had more range than people assume today. Christian Dior's dramatic new-look silhouette from 1947 shaped the formal ball gowns that fill most wedding photographs from this decade, full skirts and cinched waists. Plenty of brides, especially those on tighter budgets or marrying a second time, chose a simple tea-length dress or an elegant suit instead. The Rulebook had more room than the photographs alone suggest. A department store gown could be had for $50 to $100, but a custom dress from a local seamstress, chosen fabric by fabric over several fittings, often ran closer to $150. Every choice a bride made along that price range said something to her neighbors, whether she intended it to or not. Nothing about a 1950s wedding was purely private. Every decision was also, quietly, a public statement. Rule 11. Somewhere in the final preparations, a bride tucked something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue into her outfit, along with a sixpence in her shoe if she could find one. People assume this rhyme was born in this decade. It's actually an English folk rhyme from the 1800s, imported and popularized in America through bridal magazines until it felt like it had always belonged here. Each piece of that rhyme carried its own small logic once you looked closely. Something old connected a bride to her family's past, often an heirloom handkerchief or a grandmother's brooch. Something borrowed was meant to be returned, tying two households together even briefly. It wasn't superstition dressed up as tradition. It was a structured ceremony inside the larger one, and brides took it seriously. Rule 12. Bride's Magazine and Modern Bride functioned as the closest thing to an official rulebook a young woman could buy at a newsstand. Brides had been running since 1934, and Modern Bride joined it in 1949, and together their etiquette columns and checklists told brides exactly how many bridesmaids to have, what to write on invitations, and how to seat a reception properly. If you wanted to know the rules, you didn't necessarily ask your mother first. You opened the magazine, and the magazine told you plainly in numbered lists and diagrams exactly what was expected. These publications didn't just report on weddings. They quietly standardized them, smoothing out regional differences until brides in Ohio and brides in Georgia were following nearly the same printed checklist by decade's end. Rule 13. Once married, the honeymoon itself followed an unspoken map. Niagara Falls had been the single most iconic American honeymoon destination for over a century by this point, a reputation the 1953 film Niagara only deepened. Newlyweds could take guided honeymoon tours of the falls, staying in hotels that built their entire business around brand-new marriages arriving by the trainload every week. Florida's beaches, Miami Beach especially, and the mountain resorts of the Poconos in Pennsylvania offered the other common paths, each building its own honeymoon economy around newlywed couples. Wherever a bride and groom went, the destination carried real meaning. It wasn't simply a vacation. It was the first shared decision of the marriage, and often the last purely private one they'd make for a long while. Rule 14. Even the honeymoon suitcase followed a quiet checklist, packed days ahead with the Trousseau nightgown, a travel suit for the train, and a going-away outfit chosen specifically to be photographed leaving the reception. Guests expected to see a bride change out of her gown into that outfit before she left, waving from a car window while rice or rose petals scattered across the driveway behind her. Rule 15, and maybe the quietest one of all. Beyond the packed suitcase, there was an entire vocabulary built around approaching intimacy with modesty and ceremony rather than silence or shame. A bride's own mother, or sometimes an aunt, might have one quiet conversation with her in the final days before the wedding, brief, careful, and never written down anywhere at all. None of these 15 rules was written into law. There was no statute that fined a woman for calling a man first, no court that punished a bride for skipping her trousseau. It was enforced by something quieter, and in some ways stronger reputation, church standing, and a small town's memory, which almost never forgot who broke a rule, or when. It's easy from here to assume every 1950s marriage was arranged, cold, or purely transactional, a business deal dressed up in white lace. The letters and diaries that survive from the era tell a different story entirely. Real longing shows up in them, real nervousness, real joy, the kind two people feel when they're genuinely choosing each other. The rules gave that emotion a structure. They didn't replace it. Almost half of all American women were married by the age of 20. During this decade, one of the youngest average marrying ages the country has ever recorded. That number alone tells you how much cultural weight sat on top of a courtship. There wasn't time to drift through years of uncertainty. The rules existed partly because everyone needed to move through them quickly, and everyone needed to know exactly what came next. By 1956, that median age dipped even lower, one of the youngest points ever recorded for American brides. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A girl could be filling her hope chest at 13 and standing at the altar by 20. The entire arc of courtship compressed into just a handful of years, every rule along the way designed to move her efficiently and respectably from one stage to the next. June became the month almost everyone chose, and the reason goes back further than any bride in this decade realized. The tradition traces to the Roman goddess Juno, patroness of marriage, and it held on for practical reasons too. The weather was warm enough for an outdoor reception. The school year had just ended, freeing up every bridesmaid and guest, and so churches across the country filled with white dresses all June long. A modest wedding in this decade, dress, flowers, photographer, and a simple reception typically ran a family somewhere around $300 to $400 total. That figure meant something different depending on where you lived. For a factory worker's family, it represented real sacrifice and months of careful saving. For a comfortable suburban family, it was simply the going rate everyone quietly understood and budgeted for. Consider what all of this actually demanded of a young woman, start to finish. By the time she reached the altar, she had assembled a full trousseau, learned a silver pattern, survived a public newspaper announcement, and endured months of scrutiny over every single choice along the way. The rules weren't cruelty for its own sake. They were a kind of apprenticeship, teaching a woman to run a household and a public reputation at the exact same time. What's easy to miss, looking back from where we stand now, is how much certainty these rules actually offered a young couple. A woman in 1953 rarely wondered what stage her relationship was in. The ring told her. The pin told her. The Letterman jacket on her shoulders told the entire hallway. Today's ambiguity, the unanswered text, the undefined relationship, simply didn't have room to exist inside a system built entirely on visible signals. That certainty came at a real cost, and it's worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. A woman who wanted to call a man first, who wanted to delay marriage for a career, who simply wanted more time to decide, had very little room inside this system to say so out loud. The structure that gave courtship its clarity also narrowed what a woman was permitted to want. Both things are true at once, and neither one cancels out the other. By the very end of the decade, small cracks were already showing beneath the surface. More young women were staying in school longer, some pursuing college in numbers their mothers never had access to. The rules hadn't broken yet, not by any measure. But the rigid timeline that had married so many 20-year-olds was beginning to loosen at the edges, a slow shift that would accelerate dramatically within just a few more years. So much of what disappeared afterward wasn't really about the rules themselves. It was about the certainty they gave two people trying to understand each other. When calling faded, and chaperonage faded, and pinning ceremonies faded from campus courtyards, they took with them a shared vocabulary two people could use to understand exactly where they stood, replaced eventually by something far less visible and far harder to read. There's something worth sitting with in that cedar chest from the very beginning of this video. A girl filling it at 14 wasn't just preparing linens for some distant day. She was quietly rehearsing a whole future, one folded towel at a time, trusting a system that told her exactly what came next. Whatever you think of the rules themselves, that kind of trust, in a shared script everyone agreed to follow, is genuinely rare to find today. If any of these 15 rules struck a chord, tell me in the comments which one your own grandmother or mother actually lived by. I read every one of them, and I'm always looking for the next forgotten courtship ritual worth bringing back to life. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.